The morning sun gleamed through the tall windows of Brookes Sutton Industries, casting golden rays across the polished marble floors of the reception area. Ava Daniels paused just outside the building, taking a steadying breath as she looked up at the towering structure. The slick, modern lines of glass and steel seemed intimidating, almost as if daring her to step inside. She could feel her heart pounding, a mixture of excitement and anxiety swirling within her. Today was her first day as an intern, a day she had worked tirelessly for. Endless nights of studying, preparing, networking, all leading to this moment. Ava had dreamed of making it into a major firm, and Brookes Sutton was more than major, it was a giant in the industry, known for setting the standard in corporate innovation, and she was ready to prove herself. As she pushed through the double doors, Ava was greeted by a sleek, minimalist lobby that spoke of sophistication and wealth. The pristine walls were adorned with modern art, and the polished floor seemed to stretch endlessly under her shoes, echoing softly with each step she took. A sleek, black reception desk stood at the center, where a woman with sharp features and an even sharper gaze sat, typing briskly on her computer. "Hi, I'm Ava Daniels, the new intern." Ava introduced herself with a polite smile. The receptionist's gaze flicked up momentarily, assessing Ava with a practiced indifference. "Take a seat," she said, nodding towards a nearby set of designer chairs. "Mr. Brookes will be down to meet you shortly." Ava nodded, feeling the first hints of unease settle in her stomach. She knew Ethan Brookes by reputation, a relentless, successful CEO who had transformed Brookes Sutton into a powerhouse. But he was also known for his exacting standards and, rumor had it, his brutal management style. As she sat, Ava adjusted her blazer and tried to steady her nerves. This was what she had worked for. She reminded herself that she belonged here as much as anyone else. She smoothed her skirt and glanced around the lobby, noting the steady flow of employees who entered and exited the building, all moving with a sense of purpose and confidence. After a few minutes, a pair of elevator doors slid open, and a tall, impeccably dressed man with slicked back hair and an expression that was both intense and uninterested stepped out. Ethan Brookes. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the lobby with a look that could cut glass. He exuded authority, the kind that commanded a room without needing to say a word. His gaze settled on Ava, and his brows furrowed, almost as if he was surprised or perhaps annoyed to see her. He approached, his strides brisk and measured, each step exuding a sense of control. "Ava Daniels," he asked, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. Ava rose from her seat, extending her hand, but Ethan merely glanced at it before speaking. "You're the new intern." His tone made it sound less like a question and more like a challenge. "Yes, Mr. Brookes. I'm excited to be here," she replied, retracting her hand and standing a bit taller. She wouldn't let his demeanor shake her. He looked her over, his gaze assessing every detail, from her clothes to the way she held herself. Let's hope you're worth the investment," he said flatly. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel, clearly expecting her to follow. Ava scrambled to keep up, her heels clicking against the polished floor as he led her through the expansive office space. As they walked, employees parted to make way, their eyes respectfully averted. It was as if Ethan Brookes was royalty, moving through his domain. "Tell me, Miss Daniels," Ethan began, not slowing his pace as they navigated a maze of glass-walled offices. "What do you hope to accomplish here?" Ava considered her answer carefully. "I want to learn as much as I can, gain real-world experience, and contribute to the company's success however I can." Ethan let out a slight, almost imperceptible snort. "Contribute? Bold of you to assume you'll have anything valuable to add." His words stung, but Ava forced herself to stay calm. "I'm here to work hard, sir. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." Ethan stopped abruptly, turning to face her with a look that was both condescending and skeptical. "We'll see about that. This isn't some college seminar. Brookes Sutton demands excellence, and I have little patience for mediocrity." She held his gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Understood, Mr. Brookes." He gave a curt nod, seemingly satisfied with her response. "Your workspace is over there," he said, gesturing to a modest desk tucked in a corner of the open-plan office. "You'll be handling data entry, filing, and assisting other team members with their tasks. Don't expect anything glamorous." Ava bit back a sigh of frustration. She had been hoping for something a bit more substantial, something that would allow her to showcase her skills. But she nodded politely, knowing this was not the time to push back. "Thank you, Mr. Brookes." "I appreciate the opportunity," she replied, keeping her tone steady. He merely gave a dismissive wave of his hand before striding away, leaving her standing alone by her desk. As Ava settled into her workspace, she glanced around at her surroundings. The office was a sea of glass walls, white desks, and sleek computer monitors. Everything was meticulously organized, and the employees around her worked in near silence, their focus unwavering. She sighed, turning her attention to the pile of files on her desk. It was clear Ethan had no intention of easing her into the role. The stack of documents was overwhelming, and it was barely her first day. But Ava was determined to make a good impression. She rolled up her sleeves and began working, organizing and inputting data with precision. Hours passed as she buried herself in work, only pausing briefly to sip the coffee she'd managed to grab on her way in. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning documents with careful attention. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice someone approach until a voice broke the silence. "Hey, you're the new intern, right?" Ava looked up to see a friendly face, a woman in her mid-30s with warm eyes and a welcoming smile. "I'm Grace," she said, extending a hand. "I'm in marketing." Ava smiled, grateful for the kindness. "Nice to meet you, Grace. I'm Ava." Grace pulled a chair over and sat beside her, glancing over the documents Ava was working on. "They really didn't waste any time piling the work on you, did they?" Ava chuckled, feeling a bit more at ease. "No, they didn't, but I'm ready for it." Grace nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. Just a bit of advice Mr. Brookes can be challenging. He has high expectations, especially for interns." Ava's smile faltered slightly. "I noticed." Grace leaned in, her tone dropping. "Don't let him get to you. He can be tough, but he respects people who prove themselves. Just keep your head down, do the work, and he'll come around eventually." Ava nodded, absorbing the advice. "Thanks, Grace. I appreciate it." "Anytime," Grace replied, standing up. "If you ever need anything, just let me know." Ava watched as Grace walked away, feeling a newfound sense of motivation. She could handle this. She would handle this. Brookes Sutton was a challenge, yes, but it was also an opportunity. She just had to stay focused and work hard. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time the clock struck 5, Ava's fingers were sore from typing, her eyes tired from staring at the screen. But she had made significant progress on the files, and a sense of satisfaction filled her as she packed up her things. As she was about to leave, Ethan appeared beside her desk, his expression unreadable. "Miss Daniels." Ava looked up, startled. "Yes, Mr. Brookes." He gestured to a file on her desk. "This needs to be completed by tomorrow morning. I trust you can manage that." Ava glanced at the file, a thick binder filled with complex data. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the task settle heavily on her shoulders. But she nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, sir, I'll have it done." Ethan gave a curt nod, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned and walked away. Ava watched him go, a mix of frustration and determination brewing within her. She had hoped for a word of encouragement, or at least acknowledgement of her hard work, but Ethan offered neither. To him, she was just another cog in the machine, an expendable intern with no value beyond her ability to complete tasks. But she wasn't going to let his attitude break her. Ava took a deep breath, clutching the binder tightly. This was her chance to prove herself, to show that she was more than just an intern. She would complete the task, and she would do it well. As she left the office that evening, the weight of the binder in her bag was a reminder of the challenge that lay ahead. But Ava's resolve was stronger than ever. She would face whatever Ethan threw her way, and she would prove that she belonged at Brookes Sutton. Because deep down, Ava knew something Ethan didn't. She wasn't just any intern. And soon enough, he would realize that too. Ava arrived at the office early the next morning, the weight of the file Ethan had given her still fresh in her mind. She'd spent most of the night working on it, meticulously analyzing the data and preparing a comprehensive report. The tiredness from her late night lingered, but she knew that showing weakness wasn't an option. She adjusted her blazer, took a deep breath, and stepped into Brookes Sutton, determined to start the day on the right foot. The office was quiet in the early hours, with only a few employees scattered about, their heads down, focused on their work. As she made her way to her desk, Ava noticed Ethan already at his office, visible through the glass walls. He was deeply engrossed in a phone call, his expression as intense as ever. She couldn't shake the thought that he somehow thrived on exerting pressure on others that seemed to energize him. Ava set her bag down and quickly booted up her computer, preparing her materials for the presentation of her findings. She double-checked her calculations, refining each point, ready to defend her analysis. But as the clock neared 9, her confidence began to waver. The task he had given her was complex, the type of assignment typically handled by senior staff, not interns. Ava's thoughts were interrupted by the familiar click of Ethan's shoes against the polished floor as he approached her desk. She looked up, her expression composed, but her nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone as brisk as ever. "I trust you've finished the analysis I assigned." "Yes, Mr. Brookes," she replied, handing over the file. "I've organized the data and included some recommendations based on the current trends and projections." Ethan took the file, flipping through the pages with practiced indifference. His brow furrowed as he skimmed her work, and Ava's stomach tightened. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity as she waited for his reaction. Finally, he looked up, his gaze scrutinizing her. "These projections," he started, his voice carrying an edge of skepticism, "they seem ambitious. Are you certain about your numbers?" Ava straightened, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Yes, Mr. Brookes. I double-checked all the calculations, and I believe these projections are accurate based on the current market data." Ethan's lips tightened, and he narrowed his eyes, as if searching for a flaw in her confidence. "I see," he said coolly, "but it's easy to get lost in numbers, Miss Daniels. Real-world decisions are far more complex." Ava felt her cheeks flush but held her ground. "I understand, sir. I accounted for possible variances and the recommendations are based on conservative estimates." He let out a dismissive sigh, handing the file back to her. "Conservative? It seems you're trying too hard to impress. Focus on precision, not grandeur." The words stung, but Ava bit her tongue. She knew she couldn't afford to react, not here, not with him. Ethan wasn't just any boss he was watching, testing her, pushing to see if she would crack. And Ava was determined not to give him the satisfaction. "Thank you for the feedback, Mr. Brookes," she said, her voice steady. He merely nodded before turning on his heel, leaving her standing there, clutching the file in her hands. The dismissal felt like a slap, his words echoing in her mind. She knew her work had been solid, but Ethan's constant doubt, his reluctance to acknowledge her effort, it was wearing her down. She'd expected challenges, but she hadn't anticipated the relentless scrutiny, the feeling of never quite measuring up. Throughout the day, Ethan continued his icy treatment. During team meetings, he would either ignore her entirely or throw challenging questions her way, each one designed to undermine her. Ava would respond calmly, offering concise answers and demonstrating her grasp of the material. But no matter how well she performed, he would always find a flaw, a reason to discount her contributions. As the days passed, Ava began to notice the subtle ways Ethan's behavior impacted her standing with her colleagues. Some seemed to mirror his dismissive attitude, treating her like a temporary fixture rather than a valued team member. A few whispered conversations halted whenever she approached, and glances from her coworkers were often loaded with a mix of pity and amusement, as if they were watching her struggle under the weight of Ethan's impossible standards. Grace, however, remained a steady ally. She would check in with Ava frequently, offering encouragement and advice on navigating the corporate labyrinth that was Brookes Sutton. "One thing you have to understand about Ethan," Grace said one afternoon over coffee, "is that he respects strength, but he'll never admit it. He has this way of tearing people down to see who has the resilience to push through." Ava sighed, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "It's hard to stay motivated when everything I do seems to fall short in his eyes." Grace smiled sympathetically. "Don't take it personally. He's like that with everyone, especially new hires. You're doing well, Ava. Don't let him break your spirit." Despite Grace's words, Ethan's treatment weighed heavily on Ava. Her evenings grew longer as she poured extra hours into her work, hoping to somehow earn his approval. But every day felt like a repeat of the last, his biting comments, his lack of acknowledgement, his relentless scrutiny. It was exhausting. Then, one afternoon, the situation escalated. Ethan called a team meeting to discuss the company's quarterly performance, and Ava was asked to present her findings. It was a chance to prove herself, to demonstrate her capabilities in front of the entire team. She spent hours preparing, rehearsing her presentation until she knew it backward and forward. The meeting room was filled with senior executives and department heads, their expressions a mixture of interest and indifference as they waited for the presentation to begin. Ava felt a knot form in her stomach as she took her place at the front of the room, her hands slightly shaking as she opened her laptop to pull up her slides. Ethan sat at the head of the table, his gaze sharp and unyielding, as he watched her with an almost predatory intensity. She could feel his eyes on her, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. But she pushed the discomfort aside, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. "Good afternoon, everyone," Ava began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Today I'll be presenting the quarterly performance analysis and some insights into our market position." She moved through the slides, explaining each point clearly, her analysis backed by solid data. As she spoke, she noticed nods of approval from a few of the senior executives. A sense of confidence began to build within her. She was finally showcasing her abilities, proving that she was more than capable of handling the work. But as she reached the halfway point of her presentation, Ethan interrupted. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Are you certain these projections are accurate?" Ava paused, feeling her heart sink. She had double-checked every figure, every calculation, but Ethan's tone made her question herself. "Yes, Mr. Brookes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "The projections are based on the latest market data, and I accounted for various external factors that could impact our performance." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "External factors? And how exactly did you account for them?" Ava took a deep breath, explaining her methodology in detail. She could feel the room growing tense, the other executives watching with interest as she defended her analysis. But no matter how thoroughly she explained, Ethan's expression remained cold, his gaze scrutinizing her every word. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "Impressive, Miss Daniels. But in the real world, theories don't always hold up. I expect better in the future." Ava felt the blood rush to her cheeks, her fists clenching at her sides. She had given her best effort, put hours into preparing, and he dismissed it as if it were nothing. The meeting ended shortly after, and Ava left the room, her mind racing. She could hear the whispers behind her, the quiet murmurs of her colleagues as they watched her leave. It was as if she were a source of entertainment, a spectacle to be observed. Ava returned to her desk, her heart heavy. She had worked so hard, done everything right, and it still wasn't enough. She wondered how much longer she could endure this, how much more she could take before she broke. Later that afternoon, Grace approached her, a look of sympathy on her face. "Ava, are you okay?" Ava forced a smile, but her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "I'm fine, Grace. Just frustrated." Grace placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You did great in there. Don't let him get to you. Ethan has a way of testing people, but that doesn't mean you're not doing well." Ava nodded, but her resolve was starting to crack. The constant pressure, the feeling of never measuring up, it was wearing her down. She had come to Brookes Sutton to prove herself, but Ethan seemed determined to keep her in her place. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's behavior only intensified. He would assign her more work, each task more challenging than the last, each deadline tighter. Ava was constantly on edge, constantly bracing for the next round of criticism. She worked late into the night, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing her personal life, all in an effort to prove herself. But no matter how hard she tried, Ethan's attitude never softened. He would find faults in her work, point out the smallest errors, as if he were determined to undermine her confidence. One evening, as she was packing up her things, Ethan appeared at her desk, his expression as cold as ever. "Miss Daniels," he began, his voice low, "I need these reports on my desk first thing tomorrow morning, and make sure there are no mistakes." Ava looked down at the stack of documents he had placed in front of her. It was an impossible amount of work, especially with the deadline he had given her. She glanced up at him, hoping for a hint of leniency, but his gaze was unyielding. "Yes, Mr. Brookes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, satisfied, before walking away, leaving her alone with the daunting task. As the office emptied out, Ava remained at her desk, her exhaustion weighing heavily on her. She felt trapped, caught in a cycle of relentless pressure and impossible expectations. She had given everything to this job, but it seemed like no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough for Ethan Brookes. But as she stared at the pile of documents in front of her, a spark of determination ignited within her. She would finish the reports, she would meet his deadline, and she would do it flawlessly. She would show him that she was more than capable, that she was more than just an intern. Because Ava Daniels wasn't someone who backed down. And if Ethan wanted to test her, she would rise to the challenge no matter how much it took from her. The exhaustion of the past few weeks weighed on Ava as she stared at her computer screen, her eyes glazed over from hours of poring over numbers and graphs. The entire weekend had been spent on yet another high-pressure project from Ethan, a series of complex financial projections that were crucial for an upcoming board presentation. She had barely left her apartment, surviving on caffeine and the stubborn determination not to let Ethan break her. Her friends had started to notice her absence, but when they reached out, she had only vague excuses and promises that she'd see them soon. The truth was, she had no idea when soon would be. This morning, however, Ava felt an unexpected strength as she reviewed the final report. She knew her analysis was sharp, her calculations flawless. Ethan had pushed her to her limits, but she'd met every challenge. Despite the long hours and relentless criticism, she was determined to deliver work he couldn't ignore. As the clock ticked closer to 9 a.m., Ava gathered her files and headed to the conference room, where the senior leadership team would soon be seated. This was her moment to shine, to finally demonstrate her capabilities in a way that no amount of dismissive remarks from Ethan could undermine. Her heart pounded with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. She'd spent every spare moment refining her findings, preparing her presentation down to the smallest detail. The conference room was already bustling with executives and department heads, their voices filling the space with a low hum of conversation. Ava took her place at the head of the table, setting up her laptop and connecting it to the large screen at the front of the room. She reviewed her slides one last time, rehearsing her opening lines in her mind. Then Ethan entered. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, conversation dwindling as everyone turned their attention to the man who commanded the room. Ethan Brookes walked with an air of authority, his gaze sweeping over everyone before landing on Ava. For a moment she thought she saw something new in his expression, a flicker of surprise, maybe even a hint of respect. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by his usual cold, unreadable demeanor. "Let's get started," he said, taking his seat and gesturing for her to begin. Ava took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and launched into her presentation. She moved through the slides with precision, explaining her analysis and detailing the financial projections with confidence. As she spoke, she could feel the eyes of the executives on her, some nodding in agreement with her findings. She could see that she was making an impact, that her hard work was finally being recognized. Ethan, however, remained silent, his expression as stony as ever. She couldn't tell if he was impressed, indifferent, or simply waiting for a moment to cut her down. Her resolve didn't waver, though she continued with her presentation, refusing to let his lack of reaction shake her confidence. As she reached the final slides, which included a series of recommendations based on her projections, Ava felt a swell of pride. She had delivered everything Ethan had asked for and more. This was her best work, and she knew it. And in conclusion, Ava said, her voice steady, "If we implement these strategies, Brookes Sutton can expect to see a substantial increase in revenue over the next 2 quarters, with a minimized risk profile across our key investments." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. She glanced around the room, seeing nods and murmurs of approval from the senior executives. For the first time, she felt like a true part of the team, someone whose contributions mattered. But Ethan wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, as he studied her with a critical gaze. The room fell silent, everyone waiting for his response. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone as icy as ever. Your projections are interesting. However, I'm curious how you arrived at these numbers. From where I'm sitting, it seems you've made some assumptions that are a bit optimistic. Ava felt her stomach clench, but she kept her expression composed. I base my projections on the latest market trends and historical data. I accounted for potential variances in consumer behavior and the impact of external economic factors. Ethan's mouth twisted into a faint smirk. And you're confident these projections are reliable? Yes, Ava replied firmly. I double-checked every calculation and tested various scenarios. I'm confident in the accuracy of my analysis. Ethan's gaze hardened, and Ava could sense the tension in the room as he prepared to deliver his critique. The other executives watched with wary expressions, as if they too were bracing for whatever cutting remarks he might make. So you're confident, Ethan said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I'm glad to hear it, Miss Daniels, but confidence isn't a substitute for experience. This is the real world, not an academic exercise. The words hung heavy in the air, and Ava felt the familiar sting of his condescension. But this time, something inside her snapped. She'd worked tirelessly, sacrificed her personal life, and poured everything into this project. And yet here he was, belittling her in front of the entire leadership team, as if her effort meant nothing. Ava drew in a steadying breath, her gaze unwavering as she met Ethan's eyes. With all due respect, Mr. Brookes, I believe my analysis is not only sound but also relevant to the company's goals. I stand by my findings. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. The other executives exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by Ava's boldness. Ethan's expression darkened, and for a moment, Ava thought he might lash out, cutting her down even further. But instead, he simply stared at her, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Very well, Miss Daniels, he said, his tone deceptively calm. Let's see how your projections hold up in the next quarter. If they fail to meet expectations, you'll be held accountable. Ava felt a surge of anger, but she kept her composure. Understood, Mr. Brookes. I welcome the accountability. The tension in the room was palpable as Ethan held her gaze for a few moments longer, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked away, addressing the other executives as if nothing had happened. Let's move on, he said, his tone brisk. We have a lot to cover today. Ava returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had stood up to Ethan, refused to let him undermine her work, and even though he hadn't acknowledged her effort, she felt a newfound sense of empowerment. She was no longer the intimidated intern trying to gain his approval. She was a professional, confident in her abilities and determined to earn her place at Brookes Sutton. The meeting continued, but Ava barely registered the discussions that followed. She was still replaying the exchange with Ethan in her mind, the mixture of fear and exhilaration she had felt when she'd pushed back against him. She knew she'd taken a risk, but she also knew it was necessary. Ethan needed to see that she wasn't someone he could simply dismiss or belittle. She had a voice, and she would use it. After the meeting, as the executives filed out of the room, Grace caught up with Ava, her eyes wide with admiration. Ava, that was. Incredible, Grace whispered, a smile breaking across her face. I don't think I've ever seen anyone stand up to Ethan like that. Ava smiled, a sense of pride swelling within her. Thank you, Grace. I just couldn't sit there and let him undermine my work again. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. You've earned his respect, whether he admits it or not. Keep pushing, Ava. You're making a real impact here. Ava's heart swelled at Grace's words. For the first time, she felt like she was truly seen and valued. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel her determination. As she returned to her desk, Ava noticed Ethan watching her from his office, his gaze cold and calculating. She couldn't read his expression, but she sensed that their confrontation had shifted something between them. She was no longer just an intern in his eyes. She was a challenge, a force he hadn't anticipated. The rest of the day passed in a blur as Ava threw herself into her work, her mind racing with thoughts of the meeting. She knew she had crossed a line with Ethan, but she also knew it was a line that needed to be crossed. She wouldn't let him bully her into silence. Later that afternoon, Ethan summoned her to his office. Ava took a deep breath, steeling herself as she entered the glass-walled space. Ethan sat behind his desk, his expression impassive as he gestured for her to sit. "Miss Daniels," he began, his voice low and controlled. "I want to make something clear. This isn't a game. Your job here is to support the team, not challenge my decisions." Ava met his gaze, her voice steady. "I understand that, Mr. Brookes. But I believe that supporting the team includes presenting accurate and thorough analysis, even if it doesn't align with your perspective." Ethan's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "I don't need an intern to tell me how to run my company." Ava took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not trying to tell you how to run your company, sir. I'm simply doing the job I was hired to do. My analysis was thorough and based on extensive data. I believe that's what you expect from your team." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. But Ava refused to look away, refusing to back down. Finally, he let out a slow sigh, leaning back in his chair. "You're bold, Miss Daniels. I'll give you that much." Ava allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Brookes. But don't mistake my tolerance for approval," he continued, his tone icy. "I expect excellence from my team, and that includes respecting the hierarchy." Ava nodded, understanding his veiled warning. "Understood, Mr. Brookes." He studied her for a moment longer, then dismissed her with a curt nod. Ava rose, feeling a mixture of relief and pride as she exited his office. She had stood her ground, defended her work, and held her own against the CEO. She knew she still had a long way to go, but this was a victory, a small but significant step towards earning her place at Brookes Sutton. As she returned to her desk, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had proven that she wasn't just an intern to be dismissed or underestimated. She was a capable, resilient professional, and she would continue to fight for her place in the company. The road ahead would be challenging, and she knew Ethan would continue to test her. But Ava was ready. She had faced his scrutiny, endured his criticism, and emerged stronger. She would prove herself not just to Ethan but to everyone at Brookes Sutton. And maybe, just maybe, she would change more than just her own career path. As Ava returned to her desk, the office atmosphere seemed to carry a subtle shift. She noticed colleagues who had previously avoided eye contact now giving her respectful nods or glances of approval. Word of her confrontation with Ethan had clearly spread. But while the acknowledgement gave her a small boost, she was far from complacent. She knew this was only the beginning. Ethan was not a man to let a challenge go unmet, and Ava had a feeling he would be watching her more closely than ever. The remainder of the day passed with Ava diving into new assignments and following up on her presentation's findings, but an underlying unease nagged at her. Ethan's final words echoed in her mind, "Don't mistake my tolerance for approval." He had respected her stance, perhaps, but there was no denying the unspoken message he was not someone to be pushed. As evening settled in, Ava found herself still at her desk, the office nearly empty. A handful of people were scattered around, including Grace, who was sending off emails before packing up. Ava was trying to focus on her screen, her eyes scanning lines of data, but her mind kept wandering back to the exchange in Ethan's office. She replayed it, searching for any signs that she had gone too far or missed an opportunity to gain ground. The stakes felt higher than ever, and she knew she couldn't afford a misstep. As she prepared to finally call it a day, she heard a knock on her desk. She looked up to see Grace standing there, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Late night?" Grace asked, handing her one of the cups. Ava nodded, taking the coffee with a grateful smile. "Yeah, I guess so. Thanks, Grace, you didn't have to." "After the day you've had. Trust me, you deserve it," Grace said, sliding into the chair beside Ava's desk. She took a sip, eyeing Ava thoughtfully. "You know, I've been here long enough to see people come and go, especially interns. But I have to say, I haven't seen anyone handle Ethan the way you did today." Ava let out a small laugh, the tension easing just slightly. "I'm not sure I handled him as much as survived him." Grace smiled knowingly. "Either way, you made an impression. Ethan may act like he's invincible, but he respects people who stand up to him. You're not just another intern anymore, Ava." The warmth of Grace's words filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you. It means a lot coming from you." Grace gave a small nod, then leaned in, her expression turning serious. "But, if I may give you a word of advice, be careful. Ethan's not one to let things go easily. You've gained his attention, but that comes with a price." Ava looked down, feeling the weight of Grace's words. She understood all too well what her friend meant. Ethan was a man who thrived on control, on pushing boundaries to see who could withstand the pressure. She was already feeling that weight, and she knew it would only grow. "Thanks, Grace," Ava said quietly. "I appreciate the warning." Grace gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Just keep doing what you're doing, and don't let him see you sweat." As Grace left, Ava sat alone, her thoughts racing. The quiet of the office wrapped around her, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps from cleaning staff. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a precipice, that this day had marked a turning point in her journey at Brookes Sutton. The following morning, Ava walked into the office with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She was prepared for the tension to linger, for Ethan to impose yet another challenge or find some new way to test her resilience. But as she settled in at her desk, she was surprised to find a different kind of tension brewing. She received an email from Ethan's assistant, a curt message instructing her to meet him in the conference room in 10 minutes. The subject line simply read "Department Meeting Preparation." When she entered the conference room, she was surprised to find it already filled with other senior team members, all busy reviewing files and checking their devices. It was unusual to see so many people gathered this early, and the energy in the room felt taut, expectant. Ethan stood at the front, a series of charts and spreadsheets displayed on the screen behind him, his posture tense but controlled. As Ava approached, Ethan glanced at her with an unreadable expression before clearing his throat and addressing the group. "Thank you all for joining on short notice," he began, his tone authoritative. "As most of you are aware, our quarterly review revealed some inconsistencies in our regional performance metrics. Ms. Daniels' recent projections indicated a need for adjustments to our current strategies, which is why I've called this meeting." Ava felt a flush of surprise. He was referencing her analysis openly and in front of the entire senior team. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of respect in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We'll need to double down on the projections Ms. Daniels has provided," he continued, looking directly at her. "I expect detailed, department-specific reports by the end of the week. Each of you will coordinate with Ms. Daniels to ensure your teams are aligned." Ava's mind raced. Ethan was assigning her a significant role, directly linking her work with each department head. It was a rare opportunity, one that interns almost never received. But as she looked around the room, she could see the uncertainty and, in some cases, mild resentment in the eyes of the senior executives. Ethan's sudden confidence in her had clearly caught them off guard. "Yes, sir," Ava replied, keeping her tone even. Inside, she was a mix of nerves and excitement. This was her chance to truly prove herself, but she knew the scrutiny would be intense. The meeting proceeded, with each department head discussing their targets and the adjustments they would need to make. Ava kept meticulous notes, determined to stay organized and prepared. Ethan remained cool and focused, occasionally glancing in her direction, as if assessing her reaction. As the meeting concluded, the department heads filed out, some giving her polite nods, others barely glancing her way. Ava could sense the complex undercurrents in the room. This wasn't just a simple assignment. By placing her in a collaborative role with senior staff, Ethan had effectively placed her under the microscope. Once the room was empty, Ethan closed his laptop and turned to Ava. His expression softened just slightly, though his eyes held a stern intensity. "You wanted a chance to prove yourself, Miss Daniels," he said quietly. "Here it is." Ava straightened, meeting his gaze head-on. "I won't let you down, Mr. Brookes." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I hope so. You've shown promise, but one good presentation doesn't guarantee success. This is a fast-paced environment, and there's little tolerance for error." Ava nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I understand, sir." Ethan gave a slight nod, his eyes narrowing as if measuring her resolve. "Good, I'll be watching closely." With that, he left, leaving Ava alone in the empty conference room, her thoughts swirling. She had asked for this chance, and now it was hers. But Ethan's warning echoed in her mind. There was no room for mistakes. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ava spent long hours meeting with each department head, gathering data, and synthesizing their input into cohesive reports. It was grueling work, requiring her to juggle multiple tasks and personalities, but she threw herself into it with a determination that bordered on obsession. Despite the pressure, Ava began to find her rhythm. She quickly earned the respect of a few department heads who recognized her dedication and thoroughness. Grace, always supportive, was a calming presence, offering advice and helping her navigate the intricate dynamics of Brookes Sutton. But the challenge grew more intense with each passing day. As the week drew to a close, Ava was running on minimal sleep, fueled by coffee and sheer willpower. The workload was relentless, and Ethan's expectations were as high as ever. He had started sending her emails late at night, each one filled with pointed questions about her progress, each one a reminder that he was watching her every move. One evening, as she sat alone in the dimly lit office, Ethan appeared at her desk, his expression impassive. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone deceptively calm. "I hope you're prepared for tomorrow's presentation. The board will be joining us, and they'll expect results." Ava looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "I am Mr. Brookes. I've reviewed the data thoroughly, and I'm confident in our findings." Ethan studied her, his gaze piercing. "Confidence is one thing, Miss Daniels. Precision is another. Don't mistake one for the other." Ava's jaw tightened, but she nodded, refusing to let his words shake her. She had worked too hard to let self-doubt creep in now. The next morning, as she entered the boardroom, Ava felt a surge of adrenaline. The board members were already seated, their expressions serious and expectant. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his gaze fixed on her with a stern intensity. As she began her presentation, Ava felt the weight of their scrutiny, each question from the board members cutting into her analysis with surgical precision. She answered each one with confidence, backing her findings with data, refusing to let their skepticism intimidate her. But as the questions continued, she felt the strain of the week pressing down on her. Her answers came slower, her focus waning. She could feel Ethan watching her, his expression impassive, and she knew he was waiting for her to falter. And then, a board member asked a question that caught her off guard, a detailed inquiry about a specific variable she hadn't accounted for. Her mind raced, but for the first time she had no answer. She hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who watched her in silence. For a fleeting moment, Ava's confidence wavered. She felt the weight of her exhaustion, the pressure of the past week, all pressing down on her. But then something shifted inside her. She took a deep breath, meeting the board member's gaze. "I appreciate the question," she said calmly. "While I haven't accounted for that variable directly, I believe it's something we can incorporate in our next analysis to provide a more comprehensive perspective." The board member nodded, satisfied, and the tension in the room eased slightly. Ava continued with her presentation, finishing with a strength she didn't realize she still possessed. As the meeting concluded, Ethan approached her, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Well done, Miss Daniels," he said quietly. Ava felt a surge of pride. She had survived Ethan's test, earned his acknowledgement, and, perhaps, his respect. The board meeting was over, but the tension from it lingered in Ava's chest as she returned to her desk. Her mind replayed every moment of her presentation, every question she'd answered and every skeptical glance from the board members. She knew she had done well, yet Ethan's face was as inscrutable as ever. He barely acknowledged her afterward, nodding curtly before dismissing the room. Ava tried not to take it personally. She had grown accustomed to his lack of praise, his reluctance to show approval, but the slight sting remained. As she packed up her notes, she heard a low murmur nearby and glanced over to see a few senior executives talking in hushed tones. She recognized two of them, Alan from finance and Deborah from marketing, two department heads she had worked closely with over the past weeks. Normally they would acknowledge her with a nod or polite smile, but today they seemed preoccupied, casting furtive glances her way. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was nothing, but as she turned back to her computer, she caught fragments of their conversation that made her pause. If she knew who her father was. Ethan might think twice. Alan's voice was barely audible, but it was enough to send a jolt of shock through Ava. Her father? Ava's mind raced, piecing together snippets from the conversations she'd overheard over the past weeks. She'd always known her father was a respected figure in the business world, but she'd never considered that his reputation might influence her career here. Her father had never intervened in her professional life, always encouraging her to forge her own path. She had taken pride in that, in knowing her accomplishments were entirely her own. But the implications of Alan's words unsettled her. She had no idea if Ethan knew her father's identity, and she certainly hadn't intended for it to come into play. Yet she couldn't ignore the possibility that her last name Daniels could be recognized by those who knew her father's legacy. The question now wasn't just whether Ethan knew, but if he cared. The thought left her feeling both unsettled and frustrated. Was she being judged on her own merit or because of her family's legacy? That evening, Ava returned to her apartment with a mind still churning. She tried to focus on unwinding, preparing a quick meal and putting on some music, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the office. If people in the company knew who her father was, did they view her efforts through a biased lens? Was that why some of the senior staff had been so cautious around her? Or was it in fact the reason why Ethan seemed determined to scrutinize her every move, unwilling to give her any credit? The next morning, Ava walked into the office with a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to prove herself, regardless of her background or connections. She didn't need her father's reputation to secure her place here. She wanted her work to speak for itself. As she made her way to her desk, she saw Ethan standing by the windows, staring out at the cityscape. He turned as she approached, his expression neutral but his gaze intense. She steeled herself, knowing that he would have something to say about yesterday's board meeting. "Miss Daniels," he began, his voice as composed as always. "Your presentation yesterday was thorough. You handled the board's questions well." Ava blinked, taken aback. It was rare for Ethan to give even the faintest hint of praise, and his acknowledgement, however reserved, caught her off guard, but his tone shifted quickly, growing more pointed. However, he continued, "Thoroughness isn't enough. The board expects excellence, not competence. You have potential, but potential alone won't sustain you here." Ava resisted the urge to roll her eyes, masking her frustration with a tight smile. "Understood, Mr. Brookes. I'll keep that in mind." He studied her for a moment, as if assessing her reaction. "I'm glad to hear it," he said curtly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "You'll be joining the senior staff meeting this afternoon. There's an upcoming partnership we're pursuing, and I'd like your input on the preliminary projections." Ava nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of surprise and excitement. Joining the senior staff meeting was a rare privilege for an intern, a sign that she was gaining recognition. Yet Ethan's scrutiny loomed over her, a constant reminder that he was watching her every move. As he turned to leave, she couldn't help but wonder if his invitation had an ulterior motive. The senior staff meeting later that day brought Ava face to face with some of the most influential figures in the company. They discussed the potential partnership with another major corporation, an opportunity that could propel Brookes Sutton into a new tier of corporate influence. The atmosphere in the room was charged with anticipation and ambition. As the meeting progressed, Ethan assigned various team members specific tasks to prepare for the potential deal, each task a critical piece of the larger puzzle. Ava took meticulous notes, analyzing the data Ethan had provided as she prepared her recommendations. But just as the meeting began to wind down, something unexpected happened. One of the board members mentioned the name of a key figure they were hoping to bring into the partnership, a figure whose reputation alone could elevate the company's credibility. Ava froze as the name left his lips. It was her father. The room fell silent, and Ava felt the weight of every gaze turning toward her. Ethan's expression remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a glimmer of curiosity, as if he were finally putting the pieces together. Ava's heart pounded as she fought to keep her composure. She hadn't planned for her family connection to surface, especially not in such a high-stakes meeting. Her father's role in this deal could complicate everything, and she dreaded the thought of how Ethan might use it against her. But instead of acknowledging her connection, Ethan continued as if nothing had happened, addressing the room with his usual authority. "If we can secure this partnership, it will position us as a leading innovator in the industry. I expect each of you to contribute to making this a success." He dismissed the team with a nod, and the room emptied quickly. Ava lingered, gathering her things slowly, hoping to avoid a confrontation with Ethan. But as she turned to leave, he called her name. "Miss Daniels," he said, his tone unreadable. "A moment, please." She took a deep breath, bracing herself as she turned to face him. Ethan's gaze was sharp, his eyes studying her with a mixture of intrigue and something she couldn't quite identify. "You didn't mention that your father was involved in this deal," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Ava met his gaze, determined not to let him see her discomfort. "I didn't think it was relevant, sir. My work here has nothing to do with my family." He raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Interesting perspective. But I wonder if the board would agree." Ava's jaw tightened. She could sense the underlying threat in his words, the implication that her father's involvement could be used against her if she didn't tread carefully. But she refused to let him intimidate her. "With all due respect, Mr. Brookes, I was hired based on my qualifications, not my connections. I intend to prove myself on my own merit." Ethan regarded her with a calculating expression, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken tension. "Very well, Miss Daniels," he said finally, his tone laced with a hint of amusement. "But remember, success in this company isn't just about qualifications. It's about knowing when to leverage your assets." Ava felt a flash of anger at his words, but she held her tongue, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her ruffled. She gave him a curt nod, then turned and left the room, her heart pounding with frustration. Ethan's comment gnawed at her, the suggestion that her family ties could somehow dictate her success. It felt like an insult to everything she had worked for, every late night and every sacrifice she had made to prove herself. Over the next few days, Ava threw herself into her work with renewed determination. She prepared detailed reports for the upcoming partnership, her analysis thorough and precise. But as she delved deeper into the project, she began to notice subtle shifts in the way her colleagues treated her. Some were more respectful, acknowledging her with polite nods or even offering assistance. Others, however, seemed wary, as if her family connection had somehow made her untouchable. The division in attitudes only fueled her frustration. She hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't wanted her father's reputation to precede her. She wanted to be seen as Ava Daniels, an intern who was competent and dedicated, not as someone who carried her father's influence. The tension reached a boiling point one afternoon when Alan from finance approached her desk, his expression guarded. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone before leaning in. "Listen, Ava," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of us know who your father is, and I think you should be careful. Ethan isn't known for letting anyone have leverage over him." Ava's eyes narrowed, her patience wearing thin. "I didn't ask for any special treatment, Alan. I'm here to do my job, just like everyone else." Alan looked taken aback by her response, but he nodded slowly. "I know that, but Ethan, he's not someone to cross. Just be careful, all right?" With that, he walked away, leaving Ava to stew in her frustration. She felt trapped, caught between her desire to succeed on her own terms and the reality of her family's influence. She hated the thought of being viewed as someone who had coasted on privilege, but she also couldn't deny the undercurrents of power dynamics that were now shaping her experience at Brookes Sutton. That evening, as she walked out of the office, she made a silent vow to herself. She would succeed, but not because of her family's legacy. She would rise above the expectations and assumptions, proving to Ethan and everyone else that she was more than her last name. As she left the building, the city lights casting a soft glow around her, Ava felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. She was in this fight alone, but she wouldn't back down. No matter what Ethan threw at her, she would face it head on, determined to earn her place not just at Brookes Sutton, but in her own story. Ava spent the next few days working with a renewed sense of purpose, but it was laced with frustration and a gnawing unease. No matter how much she tried to focus solely on her work, the knowledge that people viewed her through the lens of her father's reputation weighed heavily on her. Every interaction felt charged, every glance from her colleagues tinged with a hidden question. Was she truly capable, or was she merely the daughter of a powerful figure who'd effortlessly slipped into a high-profile internship? Ethan had not brought up her father again, but she could feel his scrutiny intensify. Every task he assigned seemed designed to push her limits further, each project more demanding and complex than the last. Late nights became her norm, her desk often the only one lit in the darkened office as she pored over data, meticulously crafting reports and preparing for presentations. The pressure was immense, but Ava refused to break. Then came a memo from Ethan's assistant, instructing Ava to meet with him for a one-on-one discussion. She felt a twinge of anxiety at the unexpected request. Though she'd spent considerable time presenting work and delivering updates in his presence, one-on-one meetings were rare. Ava couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just business. When she entered his office, Ethan was seated behind his expansive mahogany desk, his gaze sharp and assessing. He motioned for her to sit without looking up from the report he was reviewing. Ava sat down, the silence stretching out as he continued to read, seemingly ignoring her presence. Finally, Ethan set the report down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Miss Daniels," he began, his voice measured, "I'd like to discuss your recent work on the partnership projections." Ava straightened, ready to defend her analysis. "Of course, Mr. Brookes. I've compiled the most recent data, and I believe my recommendations will support the growth projections you're aiming for." He nodded slightly, though his expression remained critical. "Your work has been sufficient," he said, the faintest hint of approval in his tone. "But I'm concerned about your objectivity in this project, considering your family's connection." Ava felt her heart drop. She'd hoped he would overlook her father's involvement. But it seemed that Ethan couldn't separate her work from her family ties. She took a steadying breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Brookes, I've approached this project with complete impartiality. My analysis is based on data, not personal connections." Ethan's eyes narrowed, and Ava could sense the tension in the room intensify. "I would hope so, Miss Daniels," he replied, his tone icy. "But in this industry, perception is as important as reality. Your father's reputation casts a long shadow, and it would be naive to think that it doesn't influence how others see you or your work." Ava felt a flash of anger but held her tongue. She knew that arguing with Ethan wouldn't change his perspective, and she couldn't afford to let her emotions show. "I understand, Mr. Brookes," she said evenly, "but I believe my work will speak for itself." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "We'll see. Just remember that this partnership is critical to the company. Any sign of impropriety, perceived or otherwise, could jeopardize it." Ava swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She knew this was Ethan's way of reminding her that she was expendable, that any misstep could cost her everything she'd worked for. But she also knew that she wouldn't back down. She had earned her place here, and she wouldn't let anyone take that from her. "Understood," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll ensure that my work remains beyond reproach." Ethan nodded, seeming satisfied, though his expression remained guarded. "Good. Now let's discuss the next phase of the project." The conversation shifted to logistical details, and Ava forced herself to focus, taking notes as Ethan outlined the next steps. But the tension lingered, a constant reminder of the precarious position she was in. As she left Ethan's office, Ava's mind was racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and she couldn't afford to make a single mistake. She knew that Ethan would be watching her every move, waiting for any opportunity to call her judgment into question. But she was determined to prove him wrong. Back at her desk, Ava dove into her work with a renewed intensity. She triple-checked every calculation, scrutinized every detail, refusing to leave any room for error. The hours slipped by as she became immersed in her work, her focus sharpened by the pressure bearing down on her. Yet, despite her determination, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan's scrutiny had reached a personal level. His warning about perceived impropriety felt like more than just a professional concern. It was as though he was testing her, seeing if she would falter under the weight of her family's influence. And as much as she hated to admit it, she wondered if he was right. Was her father's reputation an asset or a liability? Late one evening, Ava was the last person left in the office, the silence broken only by the hum of her computer. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion weighing on her as she reviewed the final details of her report. Just as she was about to shut down her computer, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned, startled, to see Ethan standing by her desk. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Still here, I see," he said, his tone neutral. Ava straightened, gathering her composure. Yes, sir. I wanted to make sure everything was in order for tomorrow's presentation. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. Dedication is important, but so is knowing when to stop. Don't let yourself burn out. Ava was taken aback by his words, his tone almost concerned. She searched his face for a hint of sincerity but found only his usual guarded expression. I appreciate the advice, Mr. Brookes, she replied carefully, unsure of how to interpret his sudden concern. For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them palpable. Then, as if remembering himself, Ethan's demeanor shifted back to its usual cool detachment. Make sure your analysis is flawless, he said, his tone brisk. Tomorrow's presentation is critical, and I expect nothing less than perfection. Ava nodded, feeling the familiar pressure settle over her. Of course, Mr. Brookes, I won't let you down. He gave a curt nod, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet office. Ava watched him go, her mind racing. The encounter had been strange, almost surreal. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his words than a simple warning. It was as if he were testing her resolve, seeing how far she was willing to go to prove herself. The next day dawned bright and early, and Ava arrived at the office feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. She was prepared for the presentation, her analysis meticulous and her findings clear. But as she entered the conference room, the sight of Ethan and the board members waiting for her sent a jolt of nerves through her. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself of everything she had prepared. This was her chance to prove herself, to show Ethan and the board that she was more than just her father's daughter. She was capable, competent, and worthy of her place at Brookes Sutton. As she began her presentation, she felt her confidence grow with each slide. She explained her projections with clarity, backing her findings with solid data, and addressing potential challenges with well-reasoned solutions. The board members listened attentively, nodding in approval as she made her case. But as she reached the final slides, one of the board members raised a hand, his expression skeptical. Miss Daniels, I appreciate your thorough analysis, he began, his tone measured, but I'm curious how much of this is based on your father's insights. The question hung heavy in the air, and Ava felt a flash of anger at the implication. She had done this work herself, poured hours into every detail, and yet the board still questioned her independence. With a calm she barely felt, Ava met the board member's gaze. With all due respect, sir, my father was not involved in this analysis. These findings are based solely on my own research and calculations. The board member nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Ava could sense the lingering doubt in the room. She glanced at Ethan, who watched her with an unreadable expression, as if assessing her response. As she wrapped up the presentation, the board members began to discuss the next steps, their voices low and serious. Ava took her seat, her heart pounding as she tried to steady her nerves. She had faced the board's scrutiny, defended her work, and held her ground. But the experience left her feeling drained, the weight of her family's legacy pressing down on her. When the meeting concluded, Ethan gestured for her to stay behind. Once the room was empty, he turned to her, his expression hard. You handled yourself well, he said, his tone guarded. But remember, this company is built on perception as much as performance. If the board senses even a hint of favoritism, it could jeopardize your future here. Ava looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right in this world, perception was everything. But she also knew that she wouldn't let her family's influence define her. Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Brookes, she replied, her voice steady. I'll ensure my work speaks for itself. Ethan nodded, seeming satisfied. But as he left the room, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that their confrontation was far from over. She had proven herself today, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, and she was prepared to face it on her own terms. Alone in the empty conference room, Ava felt a surge of determination. She would succeed, not because of her family's legacy, but because of her own hard work and resilience. No matter what Ethan threw at her, she would continue to rise, proving that she was more than just a name. She was Ava Daniels, and she was here to stay. The day of the board meeting arrived with a sense of anticipation that Ava could feel buzzing in the air. As she walked into the office that morning, everything seemed sharper, more intense. Her colleagues were busy with their own tasks, but Ava sensed their curiosity whispers quieted as she passed, and glances lingered a little too long. She knew word of her involvement in the major partnership proposal had spread, and her coworkers were likely waiting to see if she would succeed or stumble under the pressure. But Ava wasn't going to let anything or anyone distract her from the goal ahead. Today she was determined to prove herself once and for all. When she reached her desk, Ava found a message from Ethan's assistant instructing her to meet in the executive conference room promptly at 10 a.m. for the board's review of the partnership proposal. She took a deep breath and mentally ran through her presentation one last time, reviewing every data point, every projected outcome, and every possible question she could anticipate. She had spent weeks preparing for this, and she wasn't about to let her hard work be undermined. As the clock approached 10, Ava gathered her materials and made her way to the executive wing. The hallway leading to the conference room felt longer than usual, the quiet magnifying her heartbeat. She reached the door and paused, taking a steadying breath before pushing it open. The room was already filled with senior executives and board members, all seated around a massive mahogany table, their expressions serious and expectant. Ethan was standing near the head of the table, his gaze sharp as he watched her enter. Ava took her place at the front of the room, setting up her laptop and connecting it to the screen. She could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of skepticism and curiosity that had followed her since she started here. But this time there was something different. She could feel a new layer of respect in the way they regarded her, as if the rumors of her family's influence had made them question her, but her dedication and professionalism had begun to answer those doubts. As she finished setting up, Ethan took his seat and gave her a nod, signaling her to begin. She took one last deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and launched into her presentation. "Good morning, everyone," Ava began, her voice steady and clear. "Today I'll be presenting the strategic and financial projections for our proposed partnership, as well as the anticipated benefits and growth potential for Brookes Sutton. I've compiled the most recent market data and analyzed several potential outcomes to give a comprehensive overview of how this partnership could impact our company's position." As she spoke, she moved through the slides, explaining each point with precision. Her voice carried a quiet confidence that filled the room, her tone calm yet assertive. She felt her focus sharpen with every sentence, the pressure fading as she allowed herself to get lost in the material she knew so well. Ava could see that her work was landing well with the board. Several members nodded in approval as she explained key findings, and she even caught a few murmured words of agreement as she highlighted the long-term benefits of the proposed partnership. When she reached the financial projections, Ava noticed Ethan lean slightly forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he scrutinized the data. She knew he would have questions, likely the most challenging ones, but she had prepared for this. Her projections were detailed and well-reasoned, and she was ready to defend every figure. Based on current market trends, Ava continued, "We can expect an initial growth rate of approximately 8% within the first 2 quarters following implementation. With further integration and scaling, that rate could increase, positioning Brookes Sutton as a dominant force in our sector. Additionally, I've accounted for potential market variances, ensuring that our growth remains sustainable even in fluctuating conditions." As she finished her point, one of the board members, a distinguished older woman with a keen gaze, raised her hand. Ava nodded, pausing to let the woman speak. "Miss Daniels," the board member began, her tone cautious but curious, "your projections are ambitious. Given that our current growth rate has been conservative, what factors give you confidence in achieving such a substantial increase within this timeline?" Ava took a steadying breath, grateful she'd anticipated this question. "Thank you for bringing that up. I understand the projections are ambitious, but they're grounded in the current demand forecasts and the performance metrics of our potential partner. Additionally, I've taken a conservative approach in our initial rollout, ensuring that we have sufficient resources and time to integrate and support this growth. With targeted efforts, I believe we can reach these goals without sacrificing stability." The board member nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. But Ava's momentary relief was short-lived, as another hand went up, this time from Alan, the head of finance, a white man in his mid-50s with a reputation for being tough on numbers. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone sharper, "how do you plan to manage the risk associated with such rapid scaling? With the current economic volatility, any misstep could set us back significantly." Ava met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "That's a valid concern, Alan. To mitigate these risks, I've included a phased approach in the integration plan. This allows us to monitor our progress closely and make necessary adjustments in real time. Additionally, I've recommended setting aside a contingency fund specifically for potential disruptions, ensuring we have the flexibility to adapt as needed. Alan nodded, clearly impressed, though he tried to hide it behind his stoic expression. Ava sensed a shift in the room, an acknowledgement that she had anticipated their concerns and was ready with thoughtful solutions. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with a focused intensity. His usual skepticism softened into something resembling admiration. It was subtle, but for the first time, Ava felt that she had truly gained his respect. He gave her a slight nod, encouraging her to continue. With renewed confidence, Ava moved through the remaining slides, addressing potential obstacles and providing detailed recommendations on how to maximize the partnership's success. Her presentation was met with thoughtful nods and murmurs of approval from the board, and as she reached her conclusion, she felt a sense of accomplishment settle over her. And in conclusion, Ava said, her voice strong and steady, this partnership has the potential to not only strengthen our current market position, but to propel Brookes Sutton into a new era of innovation and growth. I believe we have the tools and strategies needed to make this a resounding success. Thank you. A heavy silence followed her words as the board members exchanged glances, each processing the information she had presented. Then, the board chair, a seasoned executive with a calm but authoritative presence, spoke up. Miss Daniels, I have to say, your presentation is one of the most thorough and well-prepared we've seen in a long time, he said, his tone warm with approval. Your dedication to this project is evident, and your insights are both innovative and practical. I'm confident in your analysis, and I support moving forward with your recommendations. Ava felt a wave of relief wash over her. Though she kept her expression composed, she thanked the board chair and took her seat, her heart still racing with the intensity of the moment. The rest of the room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and she noticed Ethan watching her, his gaze thoughtful and almost proud. As the board members began discussing the next steps for implementing the partnership, Ava felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had poured everything into this presentation, faced down her doubters, and emerged stronger. She had shown the board, her colleagues, and even herself that she was capable, resilient, and deserving of her place at Brookes Sutton. After the meeting, the board members and senior executives filed out, many of them offering her respectful nods or congratulatory smiles. It felt surreal, as if the journey she had started months ago had finally reached its climax. She had proven herself in the eyes of the company's most influential figures, and the weight of that accomplishment filled her with pride. As she began gathering her things, Ethan approached her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. Ava, he said, his tone carrying a warmth that surprised her, you did an excellent job today. Your preparation and attention to detail were impeccable. She looked at him, feeling a mix of gratitude and pride. Thank you, Mr. Brookes. I couldn't have done it without the support of the team. He nodded, but his gaze held hers, as if he wanted to say something more. I know I've been challenging, he admitted, his tone quiet. But you've earned my respect, Ava. You've proven that you're more than capable, and I have no doubt you'll continue to succeed here. The words hung between them, carrying a weight she hadn't anticipated. For the first time, Ethan was acknowledging her not as an intern, not as someone who needed to prove herself, but as an equal. It was the validation she had been seeking, but it meant so much more coming from him. Thank you, Mr. Brookes, she replied, her voice steady. That means a lot to me. He gave her a small nod, his expression one of quiet pride. Keep pushing, Ava. You have a bright future here. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving her to process the moment. As she walked back to her desk, Ava felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had faced every challenge Ethan had thrown at her, had navigated the complexities of her family's influence, and had ultimately proven that her success was her own. In the days that followed, the partnership moved forward with Ava playing an instrumental role. Her input became highly valued, her colleagues sought her out for advice, and her reputation as a dedicated and capable professional grew steadily. She was no longer the uncertain intern trying to prove herself. She was a respected member of the team, someone whose work was recognized and appreciated. As Ava walked out of the office one evening, She took a moment to look up at the towering building, feeling a sense of belonging and pride she had never known before. This was her world now, and she had claimed her place in it. The city lights glowed above, reflecting the bright future she had fought so hard to achieve. Ava Daniels had come to Brookes Sutton as an ambitious intern, and now she stood on the precipice of a promising career. She had faced down every obstacle, every challenge, and emerged stronger for it. And as she stepped into the bustling streets, she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The tension in the air was palpable as Ava walked into the office for what felt like the most critical day of her career at Brookes Sutton. She had been up nearly all night, finalizing details, double-checking every figure, and rehearsing her pitch for the upcoming meeting with the board. Today was the culmination of months of tireless work on the partnership proposal, and everything was riding on it. Despite the sleepless night, Ava felt an unfamiliar sense of calm as she made her way through the office. The whispers and speculative glances that once followed her now felt distant. Over time, she had carved out her place here, proving herself time and again not only to her colleagues but to Ethan as well. But she knew that today's outcome could seal her future or unravel it entirely. As she arrived in the conference room, she noticed that it was filled with senior executives and board members, all waiting in anticipation. Ethan stood at the head of the room, looking as composed as ever, though she detected a slight tension in his posture. His gaze flickered to her as she entered, and she saw something there that she hadn't seen before: a glint of respect. Ava met his gaze with a small nod, both an acknowledgement and a quiet reassurance. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice low and controlled, "I trust you're ready." "Yes, Mr. Brookes," she replied confidently. "Everything is in place." He gave a curt nod, and she took her seat, settling her notes in front of her. The board members glanced at her expectantly, and she could feel their curiosity about her involvement in the partnership proposal. This was her opportunity to solidify her position, to show once and for all that her role at Brookes Sutton was the result of hard work and skill, not family connections. Ethan opened the meeting with a brief introduction, summarizing the strategic importance of the partnership and the potential benefits it could bring. Then, with a subtle nod, he turned the floor over to Ava. Ava took a deep breath, stood up, and began her presentation. Her voice was steady as she outlined the projections, detailing the potential growth and expansion this partnership could drive. She had anticipated every question, addressing possible risks and presenting strategies to mitigate them. The board members watched her closely, their expressions shifting from interest to genuine approval as she moved through each slide. When she reached the final section, Ava made her concluding points with a quiet authority that surprised even herself. This was no longer the voice of a nervous intern fighting for validation. This was the voice of a professional who believed in her work, who had earned her place at the table. And in conclusion, Ava said, meeting the gaze of each board member in turn, "This partnership represents a transformative opportunity for Brookes Sutton. With the proposed strategies, I'm confident we can achieve significant growth while maintaining stability in the current market. Thank you." Silence hung in the air as she finished, and for a moment, Ava felt a pang of anxiety. But then the board chair, a seasoned executive with decades in the industry, broke into a slow, approving nod. "Well done, Miss Daniels," he said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine admiration. "Your analysis is thorough and your strategies are sound. I believe you've given us a compelling case to move forward." Ava felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she maintained her composure, simply nodding in acknowledgement. She stole a glance at Ethan, who was watching her with a faint smile barely noticeable, but unmistakable. It was the closest thing to praise she had seen from him since she'd started. The board members exchanged a few more words, discussing the next steps for implementing the partnership. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ava gathered her materials, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. She had done it. Months of relentless work, late nights, and countless challenges had led to this moment. As the board members and executives filtered out of the room, Ethan remained behind, watching her with an unreadable expression. She waited, sensing that he wanted to speak with her alone. "Miss Daniels," he began, his tone softer than usual, "you handled yourself exceptionally well today. Your work on this project has exceeded my expectations." Ava felt a surge of pride but kept her response measured. "Thank you, Mr. Brookes. I'm glad I could contribute meaningfully to the company." He nodded, his gaze steady. It's clear that you have a future here, Eva. I'm not one to offer compliments lightly, but you've shown a level of resilience and dedication that's rare in this industry. Eva took a deep breath, feeling the impact of his words. This was what she had worked for, not just his approval, but a recognition of her abilities, her tenacity, her drive. And finally, she felt that he saw her for who she was, not just an intern, not just the daughter of an influential figure, but as Eva Daniels, a capable professional in her own right. I appreciate that, Mr. Brookes, she said, her voice sincere. I've learned a lot here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Ethan's gaze softened slightly, a rare moment of warmth in his typically guarded demeanor. You've earned your place here, Eva. Keep proving yourself, and there's no limit to what you can achieve. With that, he turned and left, leaving her standing alone in the empty conference room. Eva felt a swell of emotions rise within her: relief, pride, and a quiet sense of triumph. She had endured the trials, faced down every obstacle, and come out stronger on the other side. As she returned to her desk, her colleagues offered congratulatory smiles and nods, the tension that had once marked their interactions now replaced by respect. She felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt before, a feeling that she was part of something larger than herself, something she had earned through her own perseverance. Later that evening, as she packed up to leave, Grace appeared beside her, a wide grin on her face. You did it, Eva, Grace said, pulling her into a quick hug. I'm so proud of you. That was incredible. Eva smiled, the weight of the day beginning to lift. Thank you, Grace. I couldn't have done it without your support. Grace laughed, waving a hand. Don't be modest. You've been amazing from day one. I've never seen anyone handle Ethan like you did. You've really made your mark here. Eva chuckled, feeling a sense of warmth spread through her. It feels good to finally be seen for my work. Grace's expression turned thoughtful. You've earned that, Eva. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You're one of us now. Ava's heart swelled at her words. She had found her place here not because of her family's influence, not because of her connections, but because of her own strength and resilience. She had proven herself, not only to Ethan and the company, but to herself. As she left the office that evening, Eva took a moment to stand outside the building, looking up at the towering glass structure that had once intimidated her. The city lights reflected in the windows, casting a glow that felt both familiar and new. This was her world now, a place she had fought to belong to. And as she gazed up at the office, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment, a feeling that she had finally claimed her own path. The following weeks were a whirlwind as the partnership moved forward, with Eva playing an instrumental role in its implementation. Her work became known across the company, her insights respected, her voice valued. She was no longer just an intern, she was a rising star in her own right. One afternoon, as she was finishing up a report, she received a message from Ethan's assistant, requesting a meeting with him. Eva felt a flicker of curiosity. Ethan rarely met with her outside of project discussions, especially now that the partnership was well underway. When she entered his office, Ethan greeted her with a nod, gesturing for her to take a seat. His expression was thoughtful, almost contemplative. Eva, he began, his tone unusually personal. I wanted to discuss your future here at Brookes Sutton. Her heart skipped a beat, and she leaned forward, her attention focused. You've proven yourself to be an asset, he continued. You have a talent for strategic thinking, and your ability to handle pressure is impressive. I believe you could have a long and successful career here if that's something you're interested in. Eva felt a surge of excitement, tempered by a sense of gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Brookes. I appreciate the opportunity, and I would love to continue growing with the company. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Good, because I have a proposal for you. Eva listened, her pulse quickening as Ethan outlined a potential path for her, one that involved greater responsibilities, a chance to lead projects, and eventually a permanent role in the strategic division. It was everything she had hoped for and more. As he finished, Eva felt a sense of clarity settle over her. She had come to Brookes Sutton as an intern, uncertain of her place, haunted by the weight of her family's legacy. But now, she was standing on her own merit, carving out a future that was entirely hers. Thank you, Mr. Brookes, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I won't let you down." Ethan gave her a nod of approval. "I trust that you won't, Ava." As she left his office, a sense of exhilaration filled her. She had earned this every step of the way. And as she walked through the office, surrounded by colleagues who now saw her as an equal, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Ava Daniels had come to Brookes Sutton as a hopeful intern. But now she was leaving that chapter behind, stepping into a new role with confidence, strength, and a vision for the future. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next.